The courtroom was unusually silent that morning. The hum of the air conditioner and the faint rustle of papers were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Judge Frank Caprio, seated behind his polished wooden bench, looked up from his docket. His glasses caught the light, and for a moment he scanned the courtroom. Another ordinary day of small cases, traffic tickets, and parking violations. The bailiff announced softly, "Next case, Your Honor. Violation number 4265, Mrs. Lisa Romano." A woman slowly stood up from the back row. She clutched a worn-out black purse close to her chest, her fingers trembling slightly. Her face was pale, her hair tied neatly but without care. The look of someone who hadn't slept well for days. As she approached the stand, Judge Caprio watched her with his signature calm smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How are you today?" She tried to respond, but her voice came out faint, almost fragile. "Good morning, Your Honor. I'm all right, thank you." He noticed she was holding something, a small photograph tucked under a folded paper ticket. Caprio adjusted his glasses and spoke softly. "All right, Mrs. Romano. It seems you received a parking ticket outside the Rhode Island hospital last week. Do you remember that day?" Lisa nodded, her lips pressed together tightly. "Yes, sir. I remember." There was a long pause. Caprio glanced down at the citation. It was a $60 fine for illegal parking in a no-parking zone, issued late at night, 2:14 a.m. "That's an unusual time to be parked there," Caprio said gently. "Most people are home sleeping." "Were you visiting someone?" Lisa hesitated. Her fingers nervously brushed the edges of the photo she held. "Yes, Your Honor. My son." Caprio leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "Your son. Is he all right?" Her eyes flickered for a moment, that brief spark of pain only a mother could carry. He, he's been sick for a while. That night the hospital called. They said I should come right away." The courtroom grew stiller. Even the clerk who had been typing paused for a second. Caprio removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. "So, you parked there because it was urgent?" Lisa nodded again. "I didn't even think, sir. I just drove straight there. I parked the closest I could and ran inside." Her voice cracked mid-sentence. "I wasn't thinking about rules or fines. I just needed to see him." Judge Caprio didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his eyes focused, his expression unreadable but kind. He could tell there was more. "How old is your son, Mrs. Romano?" 16, she whispered. "His name's Danny. He's my only child." She unfolded the photograph and set it gently on the judge's desk. A teenage boy, smiling in a baseball uniform, holding a bat over his shoulder. His eyes sparkled with the same warmth his mother's once had. "He used to play baseball every weekend," she said softly. Before all this happened." Caprio took a moment before replying. His voice was low, steady. "I can see he's a handsome young man." "I'm sure he's strong too." Lisa gave a weak smile. "He tries to be." "But, Your Honor," she hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That night, I didn't know if he was going to make it." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Caprio exhaled slowly. The gravity of her words filled the space like a heavy fog. "I see," he said softly. "And the ticket, you received it while you were inside with him?" Lisa nodded. "Yes, sir. I didn't even know about it until 2 days later. I found it under the wiper when I went to get my car. It was still there, covered in frost." Caprio leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "So you weren't parked there to break the law. You were there because you thought your son might not survive the night." Lisa nodded again. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she wiped it quickly, embarrassed. "I know it doesn't excuse breaking the rule, Your Honor, but I had no one else to drive me, and I couldn't afford the hospital parking that night." The judge's eyes softened. "You said this was outside Rhode Island Hospital?" "Yes, sir. Right near the emergency entrance." He looked toward the camera operator, the one recording the courtroom sessions. Then back to Lisa. "Mrs. Romano, I want you to know, this court doesn't just see cases. We see people, and sometimes people have reasons the law books don't understand." Lisa's shoulders trembled slightly as she nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." Caprio glanced once more at the photo, the boy's smiling face frozen in time, and then at the woman standing before him. She looked exhausted, but behind that fatigue was something powerful, a mother's unbreakable love. He could feel the tension building in the room, the kind that precedes a confession or a revelation that changes everything. Caprio spoke again, his tone now quieter, deeper. Mrs. Romano, before I make any judgment, is there anything else you'd like to tell me about that night? Lisa took a deep breath, clutching her purse as if it could hold her together. Yes, Your Honor. There's something I need to say. Her voice trembled, but her eyes met his. That night wasn't just about parking. It was about saying goodbye. The camera zooms slowly toward Caprio's face. His expression softens, eyes narrowing slightly as he senses the depth behind her words. Goodbye? He asked softly. Lisa lowered her head, tears beginning to fall freely. Yes, that night, I thought I was losing him forever. Caprio's gavel hand froze midair. The courtroom, already silent, felt frozen in time. Tears filled Judge Frank Caprio's eyes after this mother's truth. The courtroom lights hummed softly as Lisa Romano stood trembling in front of the bench. Her story had only begun, yet the weight of it already hung in the air like a storm cloud. Judge Frank Caprio cleared his throat gently and glanced down at the citation again. The crisp white paper looked so small, so meaningless, compared to the woman standing before him. He looked back up, his tone still calm, but now layered with compassion. Mrs. Romano, I want to make sure I understand everything correctly. You parked outside the emergency entrance that night, right? Lisa nodded. Yes, Your Honor. It was after midnight. The hospital lot was full, and the meter area was closed. I didn't have cash. I just stopped right there by the red line. Caprio tapped his pen lightly on the desk, thinking. He'd heard every excuse imaginable in his decades on the bench, but this wasn't one of them. This wasn't defiance. This was desperation. I see. And you mentioned your son was in the hospital. What happened to him? Lisa took a shaky breath. Her eyes darted to the photograph still resting on the judge's desk. He'd been fighting leukemia for almost 2 years. That night his doctor called. He said, Danny wasn't responding anymore. The room fell silent again. Even the camera crew looked uneasy behind their lenses. Lisa continued, her voice quivering but steady enough to tell the truth. I remember the call so clearly, Your Honor. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely hold the phone. I just grabbed my keys and drove. I don't even remember the drive there. Just flashing lights and the sound of my heart pounding. Judge Caprio's expression softened even more. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. And when you arrived? Lisa swallowed hard, looking down. When I arrived, they were already preparing him for an emergency transfusion. I wasn't supposed to be there after visiting hours, but one of the nurses saw me and just let me in. She knew. Knew what? Caprio asked gently. Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper, that it might be the last time I'd see my son awake. For a moment, even Judge Caprio looked away. He took off his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, then put them back on slowly, buying time to steady his own voice. That must have been very difficult, he said quietly. It was, Your Honor. I sat next to him for hours. He was unconscious most of the time, but I held his hand and talked to him, told him about his baseball trophies, about how proud I was. I prayed he'd hear me somehow. She paused, clutching her purse again, the same nervous motion she kept repeating whenever emotion overtook her. And when I finally left that morning, she continued, I walked back to my car and saw the ticket, just flapping under the wiper, like a reminder that even in the worst night of your life, the world still punishes you. The words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. You could hear the soft hum of the recording camera in the silence that followed. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, absorbing every word. He'd seen thousands of people stand before him, but very few stories that reached this deep into the soul. Mrs. Romano, he said softly, I can't imagine how hard that night must have been. But I want to ask you something. Why didn't you mention this earlier when the ticket was issued? You could have appealed. Lisa gave a faint smile, the kind that hides more pain than joy. Because, Your Honor, I didn't think anyone would believe me. Believe you? Yes, people look at fines and tickets like they're math, black and white. But life isn't like that. I just thought, maybe I deserved it. Maybe it was the universe's way of adding one more thing to what I was already carrying. Caprio leaned back, lost for a moment in thought, his hands folded together, elbows resting on the desk. His eyes, deep and kind, were fixed on her, but his mind was somewhere else. He thought of all the nights he'd heard stories in that very courtroom, stories of people trying to survive, not defy, and in this mother's trembling voice he heard truth. "Mrs. Romano," he said finally, "how is your son doing now?" Lisa hesitated. That hesitation was louder than any answer she could have given. She looked down again, her voice cracking. He's not here anymore, Your Honor." A gasp rippled quietly through the courtroom. Someone in the back row lowered their head. Even the clerk pressed her lips together to keep from crying. Lisa wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to maintain composure. "It's been 3 months now. I still visit his room. His baseball glove is still by the window." Caprio's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, and his eyes glistened. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said softly. "No parent should ever have to go through that." Lisa nodded, whispering, "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned slightly toward the camera, his expression heavy. "This case began as a parking violation," he said quietly, "but it's become something much more. Sometimes the people standing before us aren't guilty of breaking the law. They're guilty of being human in a moment of pain." He turned back to her, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Romano, please take your time. If there's anything else you'd like to tell the court, you may." Lisa took a trembling breath. "There is something, sir. Something I've never told anyone outside the hospital." Caprio tilted his head slightly, concerned. "Go ahead." Lisa looked down at her hands, clutching that same photograph of her son. "That night, I didn't go home after leaving the hospital." "You didn't?" She shook her head. "No, I stayed there, in my car. All night, the room went silent again." Caprio's eyes narrowed softly, curious but already sensing the emotional weight behind her words. "You mean you slept in your car outside the hospital?" "Yes, Your Honor. I didn't want to go home. I couldn't. I thought, if he woke up, I wanted to be there the moment he opened his eyes." A long, trembling silence filled the courtroom. Judge Caprio's hands folded together tightly, as though trying to steady himself against what he just heard. "Mrs. Romano," he said softly, "you don't need to apologize for being a mother." Lisa looked up, eyes filled with tears. "I'm not apologizing, Your Honor. I just want someone to understand." And in that moment, she didn't look like a defendant anymore. She looked like what she truly was, a mother who had lost everything, yet still stood with grace. Judge Caprio took a deep breath and set his pen down. "I understand," he said quietly. "I understand." The camera zoomed in slowly on Caprio's eyes, glistening, heavy, reflective. He looked down at the photograph one last time, then up at the woman who still stood, silently waiting for his judgment. Even after all these years on the bench, Judge Frank Caprio had never seen silence so heavy. A silence that didn't just fill the room, but seemed to press on everyone's chest. Lisa Romano stood trembling at the podium, clutching her photograph like a lifeline. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, as if she was standing at the edge of something too painful to say out loud. Judge Caprio's tone was low, calm, the kind of calm that comes not from authority, but from understanding. "Mrs. Romano, you said there's something you've never told anyone. What is it?" Lisa looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I wasn't supposed to be there that night." Caprio frowned softly, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "Danny, my son, he didn't want me to see him like that. The doctor said he'd been in a lot of pain that day. He was scared, but he didn't want me to come. He made me promise to rest that night." Her voice cracked. "But I couldn't. I I couldn't stay home knowing my boy was fighting alone. Caprio's face softened. His eyes lowered as if he already knew where her story was heading. So you went anyway? Lisa nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I parked by the emergency door and ran in before anyone could stop me. I sat next to him, held his hand, told him that everything was going to be okay. Her words trembled as the memory unfolded, raw and unfiltered. He opened his eyes for just a second, and he smiled. He said, Mom, you came. A tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto the edge of the podium. He asked me to sing that song, the one I used to hum when he was little. So I did, right there, with all those machines beeping around us. The courtroom's stillness deepened. Even the sound of the air conditioner faded into the background. Judge Caprio's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. And then, he asked softly. Lisa's voice broke completely. Then, he took my hand and said, Don't cry, Mom. I'll be watching your car from heaven so you don't get any more tickets. Her words hung in the air like a blade made of tears. Sharp, real, unforgettable. Caprio froze. He didn't even blink. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. That was the last thing he said to me, Your Honor, Lisa continued, her voice shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, he was gone. Someone in the back of the courtroom sniffled quietly. Even the bailiff, a man used to holding back emotion, looked away, pretending to check his clipboard. Lisa took another deep breath, steadying herself. That's why I didn't contest the ticket. I couldn't. Every time I looked at it, I heard his voice. She reached into her purse and pulled out the actual parking ticket, still folded, slightly wrinkled. I kept it, Your Honor. Not because I couldn't pay, but because it's the last proof I have of that night, the last thing that connects me to him. She laid the ticket gently on the bench, next to her son's photograph. The sight of the two together, a $60 fine and a faded photo of a smiling boy, felt heavier than any law book in the room. Caprio took a deep breath and slowly removed his glasses. He set them on the bench and rubbed his eyes, not out of fatigue, but to wipe away the tears forming there. Mrs. Romano, he began, his voice trembling just slightly. What you've just shared, that's one of the most moving stories I've ever heard in this courtroom. He paused, collecting himself. This is not just a ticket. This is a mother's love. A love so powerful that even grief couldn't silence it. Lisa looked up, her eyes red but peaceful now, as if finally, after months of silence, she had released the weight she'd been carrying. Caprio leaned forward again, his tone almost whispering. You said your son promised to watch your car from heaven? Lisa nodded faintly, smiling through her tears. Yes, sir. Every time I drive past that hospital, I look up at the sky and tell him, Don't worry, Danny, I parked legally this time. A soft laugh escaped the audience, gentle, compassionate. Even Caprio smiled weakly, shaking his head. You know, Mrs. Romano, he said softly. So you went anyway? Lisa nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I parked by the emergency door and ran in before anyone could stop me. I sat next to him, held his hand, told him that everything was going to be okay. Her words trembled as the memory unfolded, raw and unfiltered. He opened his eyes for just a second, and he smiled. He said, Mom, you came. A tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto the edge of the podium. He asked me to sing that song, the one I used to hum when he was little. So I did, right there, with all those machines beeping around us. The courtroom's stillness deepened. Even the sound of the air conditioner faded into the background. Judge Caprio's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. And then, he asked softly. Lisa's voice broke completely. Then, he took my hand and said, Don't cry, Mom. I'll be watching your car from heaven so you don't get any more tickets. Her words hung in the air like a blade made of tears, sharp, real, unforgettable. Caprio froze. He didn't even blink. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. That was the last thing he said to me, Your Honor, Lisa continued, her voice shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, he was gone. Someone in the back of the courtroom sniffled quietly. Even the bailiff, a man used to holding back emotion, looked away, pretending to check his clipboard. Lisa took another deep breath, steadying herself. That's why I didn't contest the ticket. I couldn't. Every time I looked at it, I heard his voice. She reached into her purse and pulled out the actual parking ticket, still folded, slightly wrinkled. I kept it, Your Honor. Not because I couldn't pay, but because it's the last proof I have of that night, the last thing that connects me to him. She laid the ticket gently on the bench, next to her son's photograph. The sight of the two together, a $60 fine and a faded photo of a smiling boy, felt heavier than any law book in the room. Caprio took a deep breath and slowly removed his glasses. He set them on the bench and rubbed his eyes, not out of fatigue, but to wipe away the tears forming there. Mrs. Romano, he began, his voice trembling just slightly. What you've just shared, that's one of the most moving stories I've ever heard in this courtroom. He paused, collecting himself. This is not just a ticket. This is a mother's love. A love so powerful that even grief couldn't silence it. Lisa looked up, her eyes red but peaceful now, as if finally, after months of silence, she had released the weight she'd been carrying. Caprio leaned forward again, his tone almost whispering. You said your son promised to watch your car from heaven? Lisa nodded faintly, smiling through her tears. Yes, sir. Every time I drive past that hospital, I look up at the sky and tell him, Don't worry, Danny, I parked legally this time. A soft laugh escaped the audience, gentle, compassionate. Even Caprio smiled weakly, shaking his head. You know, Mrs. Romano, he said softly, if he's watching from up there, I think he's proud of you. Not just for that night, but for having the strength to stand here and share this with us. Lisa smiled faintly, wiping her tears. Thank you, Your Honor. I just needed someone to listen, not as a judge, but as a human being. Caprio's reply came slowly, his voice thick with emotion. And that's exactly what you've got here today. He looked around the courtroom, at the quiet audience, at his clerk, at the cameras, and then back at Lisa. This court isn't about punishment today, he said. It's about perspective. It's about remembering that behind every violation, there's a story, and behind every story, there's a heart. Lisa lowered her head, tears streaming freely again. She whispered, He would have liked you, Your Honor. He loved people who listened. Caprio pressed his lips together, trying to keep his composure. His eyes were glassy now. He wasn't just a judge, he was a father. And in that moment, every parent watching that video, every viewer behind a screen, would feel that same pull in their chest, that shared humanity that made Judge Frank Caprio who he was. He finally managed to speak, his tone calm but trembling. Mrs. Romano, thank you for trusting us with your truth. You've reminded us all why compassion belongs in every courtroom. He reached forward, gently touching the photo of Danny with his fingertips. Just a brief gesture of respect. This young man, Caprio said softly, left a message behind stronger than any judgment I could ever give. The camera panned to Lisa, who closed her eyes, relief washing over her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. She wasn't guilty anymore, not in the eyes of the court and not in her own heart. In a world quick to punish, there are still moments that remind us to listen. For some stories don't need justice. They need understanding. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the faint hum of the ceiling fan seemed to disappear under the weight of Lisa's words. Judge Frank Caprio sat motionless for a long moment, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the photo that lay in front of him. The photo of a boy with a bright smile, whose memory had just filled the courtroom with a grief that was too heavy for words. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising slowly, then looked up at Lisa with eyes that glistened. Mrs. Romano, he said gently, I've been sitting on this bench for many years. I've heard countless stories, some painful, some inspiring, but what you just shared, it's one of those stories that will stay with me forever. Lisa's trembling hands clutched the podium. She tried to nod, but her lips quivered instead. Caprio leaned slightly forward, his voice growing softer, each word carefully chosen, like a father trying to comfort his own daughter. When people come before this court, most of them think they're just here for a fine. But you, Mrs. Romano, you reminded us why we're really here. Not to judge, but to understand. He paused. The camera zoomed in slightly, the kind of quiet close-up that captures every emotion on his face. He wasn't performing for the audience. He was speaking from his soul. Your son, Danny, Caprio said, looking down at the photo again, was a beautiful boy. And I believe you when you say he's still watching over you. In fact, I'd like to believe he's watching us right now. Lisa covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Caprio turned toward the audience. There's a saying, he continued, that grief is love with nowhere to go. But Mrs. Romano found a way to turn her grief into strength, into love that keeps moving. He took off his glasses and set them down gently. His next words trembled. I lost someone once too, he admitted quietly. And I know what it means to carry a memory that never fades. It changes how you see people. It changes how you listen. The audience was visibly emotional now. Even the cameraman's lens slightly quivered, as though the human behind it couldn't hold still anymore. Caprio cleared his throat softly. This court isn't about dollars today. It's about decency, compassion, humanity. He looked straight at Lisa. So I'm going to tell you what I think your son would want me to do. Lisa looked up, her eyes searching his face. Caprio leaned back slightly, as if addressing both her and the heavens above. Danny said he'd be watching your car from heaven, right? Well, he smiled faintly. I think he did a pretty good job. Because you're not guilty of anything here, Mrs. Romano. Not in my courtroom. Not in his eyes, Lisa gasped softly, covering her face with her hands as sobs escaped her. Caprio continued gently. The ticket is dismissed. But more importantly, your story will stay right here, as a reminder to everyone who walks through these doors that behind every case, there's a human heart. The courtroom audience erupted into a quiet round of applause, not loud, but deeply respectful. Even, the bailiff nodded solemnly, wiping the corner of his eye with his sleeve. Lisa tried to speak through her tears. Thank you, Your Honor. You have no idea what this means to me. Caprio smiled kindly. I think I do. Because what you gave us today, it means something to me too. He paused, then added softly, if your son could see you right now, Mrs. Romano, he'd be proud. Not because you fought a ticket, but because you stood tall in your pain and turned it into light for others. Lisa nodded, tears falling freely, but this time her face carried peace, not sorrow. Caprio looked toward the clerk. Let the record show that the case of Lisa Romano is dismissed with compassion and understanding. He turned back to her, speaking more softly now, almost like a whisper meant only for her. And let it also show that a mother's love is the most powerful force I've ever witnessed in this courtroom. Lisa placed her hand on her son's photo one last time. She whispered something under her breath, a quiet goodbye, and then smiled faintly through her tears. As she stepped away from the podium, the camera followed her in slow motion. The faint echo of her footsteps filled the courtroom as the music swelled. Soft piano notes underscored by violins. Caprio watched her leave, his expression distant, thoughtful. He leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply, the weight of the moment still pressing against his heart. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "That's why we do this. Not to punish, but to heal." The bailiff nodded quietly. "You did good, Judge," he said. Caprio smiled faintly. "She did good," he replied. "All I did was listen. Sometimes justice isn't about rules or laws. It's about remembering that everyone has a story, and some stories deserve not a sentence, but a second chance." A final shot shows Judge Caprio placing his hand over his heart, glancing up toward the ceiling, as though silently thanking someone above. Then black screen, white text fades in memory of all the stories that remind us to be kind. The courtroom was empty now. Only the faint echo of footsteps lingered, the quiet after an emotional storm. Judge Frank Caprio sat still at his bench, his eyes fixed on the now closed door through which Lisa Romano had walked out. The sunlight filtered through the high courtroom windows, falling across the polished wooden bench. A streak of golden light touched the photo of Lisa's son, Danny, still lying near the edge of the desk. Caprio reached out slowly, picking it up once more. He studied the boy's smiling face, innocent, full of life, frozen in time. And for a long while he said nothing. Then softly, almost as if speaking to the picture, he whispered, "You know, Danny, your mom reminded us all of what it means to love someone even when they're gone." He set the photo down carefully, his eyes glistening again. The bailiff, Joe, returned quietly from the back of the courtroom. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his hat in his hand. "Tough one, huh, Judge?" he said finally, breaking the silence. Caprio smiled faintly. "They all are, Joe. Every single one. But this one," he sighed. "This one hit home." Joe nodded. You could feel it in the room. Everyone was holding their breath. Caprio looked up at the ceiling, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Joe, when I started doing this, I thought being a judge was all about decisions, right or wrong, guilty or not guilty. But the older I get, the more I realize it's not about judgment, it's about understanding." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Every person who stands here is fighting a battle we can't see. And sometimes all they need is for someone to listen, really listen." The bailiff nodded, his face solemn. "You did that today." Caprio smiled gently. "No, she did. She reminded me why I sit here in the first place. The law tells us what people deserve, but compassion tells us what they need." He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly on the bench. A few moments passed in silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. Then, almost to himself, Caprio murmured, "I wish the world could hear stories like hers more often. Maybe then we'd all be a little kinder." The screen shows quiet shots of Providence, people walking on sidewalks, a mother holding her child's hand, a man helping an old woman cross the street. The same piano music that played during Lisa's exit swells gently again. In a world quick to judge, kindness is still the rarest form of justice. The scene cuts back to Caprio, still seated as he looks at the courtroom clock. The day is almost over. The golden light turns orange, fading toward dusk. He begins writing something in his notepad, a habit he's kept for years. The camera zooms in to reveal a page filled with handwritten lines. "Understand first, judge second." He closes the notebook gently and says quietly, "That's what Danny taught me today." The bailiff raises an eyebrow. "Danny?" Caprio smiles faintly. "Her son. You know, I never met him, but for a moment I felt like I did." Joe chuckles softly. "You've got a big heart, Judge. That's why people love you." Caprio shakes his head. "No, Joe. That's why I love them. Because every time I think I've seen it all, someone walks in and reminds me, there's always more to the story." Lisa Romano steps into the fading light, holding her son's photo against her chest. Her tears have dried now, her face calm, peaceful. The wind brushes her hair gently as she looks up at the sky. "We did it, Danny," she whispers softly. "We really did." The music swells, a tender, emotional, orchestral piece. As she walks away, the camera pans up toward the sky, clouds glowing orange in the setting sun. Justice isn't just about laws or fines. It's about people, their stories, their struggles, their hearts. And sometimes a single act of compassion can do what punishment never could. He's taking off his robe, folding it carefully. He sets it on a hanger, pauses, then looks at the camera directly. Breaking the fourth wall, just for a moment. "If you're watching this," he says gently, "remember, we never really know what someone's going through. So before you judge, take a second to listen. You might just change a life." He smiles, that kind, warm, genuine smile that made millions around the world fall in love with him. He turns off the courtroom lights one by one. As he walks out, the door closes slowly behind him, leaving the bench in soft shadows. Because kindness is the highest form of justice. Then a final frame appears. A dedication card reads, "In honor of every parent who's lost a child, yet continues to love the world anyway."